Good morning. I'm Shashank Joshi. I'm a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University, and I am broadcasting from California. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm really appreciative to Aaron and to Ira, John, and Nasser for allowing me to share some things that I've learned over the past few years related to psychopharmacology with diverse youth and young adults. So with your permission now, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to hope to finish this in 25 minutes and rely on a little help from my friends to answer the questions, because this is material that this group that you're hearing from today has been thinking about for several years. So today I'm going to focus on youth and young adults, and I have no disclosures relevant to this talk, except for one very important one, which is from American Psychiatric Press Incorporated, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. My goals for you by the end of this presentation is that you will be able to describe the essential features of the Y model of psychotherapy and appreciate how relational aspects of our work are key, especially with working in the frame of youth, young adults, and families, even for brief visits. I'd like you to be able to describe how to best utilize our 30-minute sessions. We are proposing that you let go of the name MedCheck and MedVisit and instead adopt the term BPV, or Brief Pharmacotherapy Visit, so that the alliance is nurtured and time is most efficiently utilized. I hope that you will be able to identify techniques adapted from evidence-based psychotherapies to enhance medication adherence, and finally, to list strategies that can cultivate a pharmacotherapeutic alliance when engaging with patients and families in schools and other community settings. So with that, I'm going to begin with an introduction and a quote from our friend Jonathan Metzl. Now, this is back in 2000 in a chapter he wrote called Forming an Effective Therapeutic Alliance. And this is from a book, The Doctor-Patient Relationship in Pharmacotherapy, Improving Treatment Effectiveness. Very influential book on my career and those of several others I'll mention here, because it highlights the importance of the relational aspect of everything we do, especially coming out of COVID. And back in 2000, he wrote, beneath a veneer of postmodern disconnect, our interactions are, at its core, a relationship between two people, doctor and patient, in a room. Now, in the youth-facing setting, I would say it's two people, probably a third, maybe a fourth, a parent, a guardian, and continued attention to and discussion of the nuances of our interactions enhance the possibilities of a successful and indeed personally meaningful outcome. So remembering that even though we're being asked to see sicker and sicker patients and given less and less time, the relationship is nonetheless more important than ever. And so when I began this work at Stanford in the early 2000s, I was interested in the idea of the treatment alliance. And Hans Steiner, who was an early mentor of mine and program director at the time while he was alive, was able to think through with me and a couple of colleagues, and we submitted our first chapter back in 2004, based on some empiric work that had been done in adults, that a strong therapeutic alliance and treatment alliance can enhance medication adherence, which can hopefully lead to better outcomes, which will, again, feed your treatment alliance. But we also learned that the treatment alliance itself may independently predict better outcomes. And that got me thinking, what are the magical ingredients? I knew, training as a pediatrician first in a triple board program, that in primary care, as well as in psychiatry, all of our work has meaning to patients and families, and that our relationship is, in a way, like a drug delivery system. Bernie Beitman wrote about this in the early 2000s. And we know from Janis Krupnik's work at the NIMH in the mid-90s that better therapeutic alliances can even predict a more favorable medication response. That was the landmark TDCRP study that was done with adults. But it got us thinking in child psychiatry that because we are adult-facing as well, vis-a-vis the children, also their parents and guardians, that this might be relevant for us. And that if we only focus on monitoring symptoms and side effects, not only might the outcome be poor, but the reason for that is the teenager's not coming back. They ain't buying what we're selling because we're not really opening the door to a conversation. We're simply doing the med check or the med visit instead of really the teen check and the family visit. So pediatricians in particular were reminded of this in the 40s. Milton Sen, pediatrician from Cornell and Yale, wrote about the psychotherapeutic role of the pediatrician. And that holds true today for any youth-facing medical specialty, in particular, as child and adolescent psychiatrists, as general psychiatrists, which many of you are in the audience, you do also see youth and young adults often. So we must be able to retain abilities as therapists in all aspects of our work. The question for us is, what is the magic that happens in the room? Here we've got two scholars looking at the blackboard with a formula here and then a result here, but then what is it in step 2? And the senior colleague is saying to the junior colleague, I think you need to be more explicit here. So what we have learned empirically and what we have learned in clinical experience is that milligrams dispensed are easy, but time well spent is hard. It's elusive, in particular when we're given less and less to deal with more and more. But I would submit to you that the less time we have in psychopharmacology, the more important our trust, our relationship, and our bond with patients and families. And this illustration comes from Simone Hasselmo from Yale University School of Medicine, an extremely talented artist who did the illustrations for our book. In fact, last summer, this book came out thinking about prescribing the psychology of psychopharmacology with diverse youth and families, which I'm speaking about here. And it was also with 2 other books on relational psychopharmacology, Prescribing Together by Warren Kinghorn and Abraham Nussbaum, and Psychodynamic Psychopharmacology by David Mintz. So these 3 were released in series. I've learned so much from each of the other books, and I'm going to take you through a bit of what we have been thinking about. So from the cover and in the first few pages, you'll read about the ideas that we have to think very carefully on when it comes to our stance regarding treatment, the patient's perception of risk and benefit. You know, we hope that it can feel angelic. The pill may have magical properties that we actually imbue it with. What we want to hope for is a trusting relationship that is helpful. What we want to avoid is an apprehensive relationship that might even become darker here as we go into the bottom panel, where we might be resigned. We might have to use something potentially harmful just to get rid of the symptoms so that we can do the work of recovery. Here you have a grenade with a doctor and a question mark and a highly stigmatized situation. As Simone reminds us here in this illustration, prescribing medications is as much the cold facts of molecules as it is the warm way in which we envelop them for delivery. So we began by a discussion of the why model. And so Eric Plaken from Austin Riggs wrote about this initially, and we adapted it in the book. Magdalena Romanowitz, who's the first author of this chapter, who is the program director at Mayo Clinic, wrote along with Sarah Rosenbaum and Carl Feinstein from our institutions about the stem of the why, the core features in any therapeutic relationship in mental health. In psychotherapy, the core or the common factors include the goals that are overtly defined, the tasks that are defined for us and the patient, collaboration, the patient and family sense that we support their best interest, and the establishment and maintenance of a bond. And then whether we are primarily in a psychodynamic treatment frame or a more cognitive behavioral treatment frame, or somewhere in the middle, say interpersonal therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy or motivational interviewing, if you don't have the core, you cannot begin the treatment. This is the basic idea behind the why model, applied not only in psychotherapy, but also to pharmacotherapy. So as Magdalena writes in our chapter, what exactly does the pharmacotherapist do to help the patient and parent feel that they are caring, trustworthy, and credible? For teenagers in particular, focusing on them, that we are their ally. We are not simply an agent of the parent, but for the parent, that we get them from their point of view. Number two, what does the pharmacotherapist do so that the patient and their parents believe that their problems are understood? And three, how do we ask about adherence? So again, a reminder, the stem of the why is the core. It fosters an atmosphere of safety and trust. It cultivates connection, and it allows us to relate. And in particular, I would submit to you that every interaction we have is cross-cultural. Trust is key. If there is an issue related to race or culture or ethnicity in current events that might impact a patient's presentation and symptoms, you might raise it in session. You might ask them if they were aware that this thing happened and have they been thinking about it, how it's affected them. So Takesha Cooper from UC Riverside wrote this chapter in the book and really encourages us to understand our own implicit bias and learn strategies to mitigate them. In fact, a number of colleagues in a number of journals over the last 5 years have been writing about racial disparities, about implicit associations in our field. And there's an invitation to understand and respect the tremendous power of bias. We all have bias. We have bias because of our life experience. And there are ways that we can learn about our bias and then employ strategies to mitigate the bias. Taking the IAT, which is free online, striving to learn about the cultures, communities, and struggles that our patients come from. And really, at the end of the day, learning something about the culture gets you in the door, but it doesn't get you invited back. If you simply stereotype and you don't individuate the story of your patient and your family, you won't be effective. So creating a broad differential diagnosis and practicing cultural humility, getting the story from each and every patient, again, especially the less time we have, the more important it is. So you will probably have your own bin of key questions to go to. We're going to present some of the ones that the literature has found helpful and some that we have found helpful. This is John DiLallo's work. John DiLallo from New York, who has encouraged us to think about evidence-based treatments as a way to enhance medication adherence. And here he points out that there are three in particular: DBT, motivational interviewing, and ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. Now for ACT, I want to invite you to visit the VIA surveys site. That's the Values in Action survey site. There's one for youth, there's one for adults. It would allow you and the patient to identify your core values so that you can work on psychological flexibility, which is the main purpose of ACT. Motivational interviewing and DBT, in the interest of time, we won't go through those, but these three in particular can be utilized so that we can understand from the patient's point of view, because they're thinking, what's in this for me? My parents have sent me here, and I feel like I'm just going to a Pez dispenser. Well, that's not why any of us went into the field, but if they see us as a Pez dispenser, as pharmacotherapists, we might ask ourselves, what kind of Pez dispenser do we aspire to be? Is it more on this side of the screen? Is it kind of nervous? Is it more on this side of the screen? With young people in particular, especially those from minoritized communities or newcomers, if there is not a background in mental health, if there is some kind of stigma, and this goes for someone from any culture, European origin or not, bringing it back to the brain can be useful. It may be more useful for the parents than for the kids. We want to really attune to, well, what is a teenager interested in? They might want to just connect with us about the brain basis of what they're struggling with, but they may not want to listen to their parents because they're done. They're sick and tired listening to the other adults telling them what's wrong with them. So it's important for us to bring it back to the brain when practical, when useful. It might be more useful for the parents than it is with the teens, but for some teens, it can be remarkably destigmatizing to bring it back to the brain. And so as we think about the different factors that affect treatment and affect adherence, we want to think about lots of different things. Peers, are they aware of any friends or peers who are taking medicine? Are they aware of any family members? What are the messages being broadcast by the media? So this chart comes from a chapter that was written by Max Rosen and Ann Glowinski in the book, and they highlight key ingredients of the BPV. Again, we are inviting you to leave the term med check and med visit to the side. We don't check on meds. We check on families. We don't do med management. We're not managing meds. We are managing medicine in the context of treating a young person. So here are some really useful ideas that they put forward. Of course, these are just suggestions, but they have to do with things like first addressing the core of the why, tending to rapport. It's nice seeing you again. You know, since we met last time, I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about. And you're sending them in that example the message that you matter to me. I haven't seen you for a while, but I've been thinking. Number 2 is to get an update on environmental influences. You might consider a modified HEADS assessment. HEADS is an oldie but goodie that comes from family medicine, the acronym for home, education, activities, drugs, distractions, sleep, spirituality, sex, suicidal ideation. These are just acronyms you can use, but it allows you to tap into some of the other important factors in their life. Number 3 is asking about and thinking about things they're working on changing related to their environment. Number 4 is eliciting and discussing obstacles or getting their thoughts on, if it's for the first time, what are your thoughts about medicine to treat this particular condition? 5 is going back to how are things going in the other treatment you might be getting in psychotherapy or family work? And it isn't until step 6 and 7, maybe the last 5 and 10 minutes of a session, where we ask about the efficacy and side effects of a medication we might be prescribing, and then providing room to answer any additional concerns or questions that they might have. And so in the early 2000s, Sabine Hack and Byron Chow in the Silver Journal, the Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychopharmacology, proposed some research-based suggestions to enhance adherence. And what we did is we came up with a mnemonic based on Sabine and Byron's article. And the mnemonic is TALK does foster superior patient care. TALK does foster superior patient care. T for therapeutic alliance with a clinician. Remember, it's a dual alliance in our work, not only with the teen or the child, but also with the parent or guardian. K is for knowledge and education regarding the medicine. D is for dosing frequency. Obviously, Q-Day works better than BID or TID. Scheduling of doses, if it has to be BID or TID. Linking it with things like breakfast for the first dose, after-school snack, and then dinner or bedtime. Palatability is interesting because, believe it or not, young people will take the medicine even if it's bitter tasting. Adults, on the other hand, not so much. And adherence goes down the more bitter tasting the medicine, not only for adults, but for those with developmental disabilities, perhaps because of a greater sensitivity to textures and tastes. But palatability is still important to keep in mind. Cost, obviously, will their insurance pay for it, or is it generic? Has it been out long enough that they could pay for it out of pocket? And again, this comes from Hack and Chow's article in the early 2000s. As I mentioned previously, we invite you to consider culture and cross-cultural interactions and nuances with every one of your patients and families. That means knowing about the tendencies of their particular ethnocultural group with regard to cytochrome P450. It also means we're paying close attention to the family's questions and concerns about taking medicine, about medicating their child, especially the younger the child, and asking very intentionally and openly about integrative treatments. In fact, most patients in pediatrics who are being treated for mental health conditions are taking or have tried some sort of what we would call CAM treatment or alternative treatment, now thought of as integrative treatments. And, now with websites like the NCCIH, from NIMH. This is the National Center on Complementary and Integrative Health. You can have access to the data and the science that shows that many of these treatment approaches are validated, do have an empiric basis. So it is up to us to educate ourselves on what's available, what's been studied. So if successful, the mind-brain dichotomy can be reconceptualized. Instead of a dichotomy, it's really more of a continuum, two sides of the same coin. And the integrative formulation will become common practice as we learn to culturally adapt to the needs of our very diverse patients and families. So in conclusion, we're inviting you to do what you have been doing for many years and what you're probably teaching your students, residents, and fellows, and that is to nurture all professional relationships necessary to sustain the child's health. In particular, your patient is likely in a public school, and there is a teacher in elementary school. There's multiple teachers if it's middle or high school. Get permission to speak to a teacher that the child trusts or someone else at school who can help be your clinical eyes. And it may take a simple phone call or an exchange of voice messages, but that is gold for you, and it's gold for them to have contact with you as the doctor for the student that they care about. Next is reading voraciously about your patient's illnesses, knowing the medicines backwards and forwards without becoming complacent in a specific area. Visiting consumer websites often. Help get your families connected to support groups. Know what the good lay references are. Know what the trash lay references are. Visit them, learn from them, and know which ones are good and you can recommend, and know which ones are not good and that you don't want to recommend. Being mindful that getting better may sometimes be disruptive. And I'm reminded of the narrative that Leston Havens wrote about, the Harvard psychiatrist wrote about in the 50s when chlorpromazine was first approved for widespread use. And he wrote in the New England Journal about the elderly woman with chronic psychosis who was very concerned about beginning this new medicine that might treat her symptoms, and yet it might actually make the voice of her deceased husband go away forever. And so remembering that change, though we may think it's good, it may be new and it may be very scary for patients. Involving the patient in the decision-making process as it relates to medication, especially in the case of teenagers, and assessing the understanding of the mental health issue from the patient's point of view and the meaning of medication from the teenager's point of view. You know, they may feel ambivalent about having gotten better on this particular medicine with symptom reduction, but they may question, is this really me? Am I who I really am on the Lexapro or the Prozac, or am I someone else? And do people not like me for the real me? My girlfriend says I'm easier to be around and more pleasant, but is that really me? And does it have to be either or? Could I be the best version of myself while taking medicine, at least for now? So these are all questions that we have to explore in the context of our relationship as pharmacotherapists. We must remain vigilant about ethnocultural issues and psychopharmacology, not only cytochrome P450, but there's a lot of handshaking that goes on when you send in a prescription electronically or write a piece of paper and give it to a child or a teen or a parent. And so how do they really feel about this medicine? Will they be able to afford it? And what will the effect be? How soon will they see an effect? Will it be bad first before it's good? And what questions do they have? Don't be afraid to get a cultural consultation. Our communities are more and more diverse. We don't have to know everything about every community, but it is important to know when we don't know rather than making assumptions. The case formulation precedes the prescription and not vice versa. So in summary, remembering that all of our actions have potential meaning to our patients and families, from how we are with our patients to how quickly we return messages, to the pens we write with that hopefully are plain and do not have a drug company logo on them, to the language we use to explain about mental health and mental illness to the way we offer realistic hope for the future. And with that, I'm going to pause my portion of the presentation and thank you for your attention. And I will be handing it over now, I believe, to John. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful ASCP meeting. I hope to see you next year. Bye for now.